October 8, 1918, Argonne Forest, France. The morning mist hung thick between the shattered trees, carrying the stench of cordite and wet earth. German Corporal Friedrich Weber crouched in the trench, listening to the usual sounds of war: artillery thunder, distant rifle cracks, the groans of wounded men. Then he heard something new, a rapid mechanical hammering that didn't belong to any weapon he knew. Boom, 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 boom. 6 shots in less than 2 seconds. Before he could process what it meant, the soldier beside him collapsed, then another, then 3 more. All from the same direction, all in the span of a heartbeat. Weber pressed himself against the muddy wall, terror flooding his chest. What kind of devil's weapon was this? The sound came again from the next traverse. Boom, 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 boom. More screams, more bodies hitting the duck boards. In that frozen moment, everything Friedrich had learned about modern warfare, about tactics, about firepower, about the superiority of German engineering, shattered like glass. What he would witness in the coming hours would haunt him forever. Stay with us until the end to hear the full story of how one American shotgun changed the face of trench warfare and made the German High Command cry out in protest. Like the video, subscribe to support the channel, and let's step back into 1918 when the Winchester Model 1912 turned the Western Front into a killing ground unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1918 should have been Germany's moment of hope. For 4 years the trenches had held. From the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, a jagged scar of mud, wire, and concrete had frozen the war into a bloody stalemate. Friedrich Weber had survived 3 years of it, 3 years of artillery barrages that turned men into pink mist, gas attacks that left lungs bleeding, and rifle fire that picked off anyone foolish enough to show their helmet above the parapet. He was 24 years old, but looked 40. His face was weathered like old leather, eyes sunken deep from sleepless nights, hands permanently stained with the grime of trench life. Before the war, he'd been a school teacher in Heidelberg, instructing young boys in mathematics and classical literature. Now he taught new recruits how to dig drainage sumps in the trench floor and where to find the driest corners to sleep when the autumn rains turned everything into a swamp. The German position in the Argonne Forest was considered strong. They occupied the high ground, with reinforced concrete bunkers sunk deep into the hillside, interlocking fields of fire, and row upon row of barbed wire stretched across no man's land like a steel spider's web. The forest itself had been reduced to skeletal stumps and shredded bark, every tree stripped bare by shell fire until the landscape looked like something from a nightmare. Friedrich's unit, the 5th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, had been holding this sector for 6 weeks. They knew every inch of their trench system, the communication trenches that zigzagged back toward the reserve lines, the fire bays where machine gun teams waited with their Maxims, the deep dugouts carved into the chalk where men huddled during bombardments. It felt permanent, unbreakable. The Americans had arrived in force that summer, fresh-faced boys from places Friedrich couldn't pronounce: Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma. At first, the German veterans had laughed at them. Green troops who didn't know how to keep their heads down, who wasted ammunition, who sometimes forgot to fix their bayonets before going over the top. Easy targets. But something had changed in recent weeks. The American attacks were becoming more coordinated, more aggressive. Their artillery had improved dramatically, walking barrages that crept forward with mechanical precision. And there were rumors, whispers that traveled up and down the trench line during the quiet hours before dawn, about a new weapon. Friedrich first heard about it from a runner who'd come from the 12th Division sector, 10 kilometers north. The man had been pale, shaking, his uniform splattered with mud and blood that wasn't his own. "They have a gun," the runner had said, accepting a tin cup of ersatz coffee with trembling hands. "It fires faster than anything I've ever seen. Not a machine gun, something else. In the trenches, you can't escape it. It just keeps firing." The other men had dismissed it as shell-shock talking, the kind of wild story that combat fatigue planted in men's minds. Friedrich had almost believed that himself. Almost. But then came the night of October 7th. The Americans had launched a small raid on the forward listening post, a shallow scrape in the earth about 50 meters ahead of the main trench line. 4 men had been stationed there. Young Bavarians, barely 18, tasked with listening for movement in no man's land and telephoning back warnings. When dawn broke, Friedrich had been part of the patrol sent to investigate why the listening post had gone silent. What they found made his stomach turn. All 4 soldiers dead, their bodies sprawled in impossible positions. But it was the wounds that made no sense. Massive trauma, as if they'd been hit not by bullets, but by something heavier, something that tore rather than pierced. And there were too many wounds, far too many for the brief firefight that anyone had heard in the night.
The sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Klaus Richter, had knelt beside one of the bodies and examined the wounds with a professional eye. He'd pulled a small lead pellet from the torn flesh, rolled it between his fingers, and looked up at Friedrich with confusion in his eyes. "Buckshot," Klaus had said quietly, "like for hunting boar. But who brings a hunting gun to war?" They'd reported it up the chain of command, but nothing came back down. The Western Front devoured strange stories every day. One more mystery was just noise in the chaos. That evening, Friedrich sat in the dugout he shared with 5 other men, writing a letter home by candlelight. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Outside, the usual symphony of war continued, the distant crump of artillery, the occasional rattle of machine gun fire, the eerie silence that fell between bombardments. His dugout mate, a former baker from Munich named Otto Kraus, was cleaning his rifle with obsessive care, pulling the bolt back and forth, checking the action. Otto was the kind of soldier who found comfort in routine, in the familiar weight of his Gewehr 98 rifle and the rhythmic motions of maintenance. "Do you think it's true?" Otto asked suddenly, not looking up from his work. "About the Americans having a new gun?" Friedrich paused, his pencil hovering over the paper. He thought about the bodies in the listening post, about the runners' haunted eyes, about the strange reports filtering in from other sectors. "I don't know," he said finally. "But if it is true, we'll find out soon enough." He had no idea how prophetic those words would be. October 8th dawned cold and gray, the kind of morning where the mist clung to the ground like a living thing. Friedrich had been awake since 0400 hours, standing watch in the fire bay, while the rest of his section caught whatever sleep they could. The trench was quiet, except for the sound of water dripping from the wooden revetments and the occasional cough from the next traverse. At 05:30 a.m., the world exploded. The American artillery barrage came without warning, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself. Shells screamed overhead, massive 155mm rounds that burst in orange-black flowers of destruction. The impact threw Friedrich against the trench wall, filling his mouth with dirt. Around him, men scrambled from their dugouts, grabbing helmets and rifles, taking positions along the fire step. The bombardment lasted exactly 18 minutes. Friedrich would later remember checking his watch when it stopped, amazed that time still existed in a world gone mad. Then came the silence, that terrible pause that every soldier knew meant one thing:
Infantry assault.
"Stand to! Stand to!" Sergeant Richter's voice roared down the trench. They're coming! Man your positions!" Friedrich climbed onto the fire step, bringing his rifle up, peering through the smoke and dust that obscured no man's land. Through the clearing haze, he could see them. American soldiers in their distinctive helmets, advancing in short rushes, using shell craters for cover, moving with the kind of tactical discipline that the Green Americans weren't supposed to have. The German machine guns opened fire first, the Maxims chattering their deadly rhythm, sending streams of bullets across the wasteland. Americans fell, but others kept coming, always moving, always advancing. Friedrich fired, worked his bolt, fired again, the familiar routine of aimed shots that he'd performed 1,000 times. But something was different about this attack. The Americans weren't trying to cross no man's land in a mass charge. They were moving in small groups, concentrated on specific points in the German line. And they were carrying something Friedrich had never seen before. Long weapons that didn't look like rifles, shorter and thicker, with a distinct profile that caught his eye even through the chaos. The first group of Americans reached the wire. Friedrich watched in disbelief as they produced massive wire cutters and began systematically cutting paths through the barricade, working with calm efficiency despite the bullets snapping around them. One fell, then another, but others took their place. Then they were through. The first American soldier dropped into the trench 3 traverses to Friedrich's left. Friedrich heard the shout, the sound of a grenade exploding, then that sound, the sound that would haunt his nightmares forever. Boom, 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 boom. 6 shots, so fast they blurred together into one continuous roar. Then screaming, then silence. Boom, 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 boom. Closer now. The next traverse. Friedrich's section scrambled into position, fixing bayonets, preparing for close combat. Otto was beside him, his face pale but determined, his rifle held at port arms. Sergeant Richter appeared, carrying a stick grenade in each hand. "Whatever happens," Richter said, his voice steady, despite the terror in his eyes, "we hold this position.
The American came around the corner at a run. He was young, maybe 20, with a dirt-streaked face and wild eyes. But it was the weapon in his hands that froze Friedrich's blood. It looked like a shotgun, but longer, meaner, with a wicked bayonet fixed to the barrel and a visible pump action that the soldier was already working as he appeared. Otto fired first. The bullet caught the American in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around. But the American didn't fall. Instead, he brought the shotgun up one-handed and fired. The sound was like a cannon shot in the confined space of the trench. Otto's chest exploded in a spray of red, the buckshot taking him off his feet and slamming him against the back wall. Friedrich stood frozen, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes had seen. One shot had done what a rifle bullet could only dream of. The American pumped the action, that distinctive sliding sound, and fired again. The soldier next to Friedrich, a kid named Hans who'd been at the front for only 2 weeks, was lifted off his feet and thrown backward like a rag doll. Then the American did something that turned Friedrich's understanding of firearms inside out. Instead of pumping the action again, he simply held down the trigger and began pumping rapidly. The shotgun fired with each pump stroke. Boom, 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 a continuous cascade of devastating firepower that turned the trench into an abattoir. Slam fire. Friedrich's mind supplied the term later, but in that moment, all he knew was terror. Sergeant Richter threw both grenades. The explosions filled the trench with smoke and shrapnel, and when the air cleared, the American was down, his body torn by the blasts. But behind him came 2 more, both carrying the same evil weapons, both advancing with that same relentless determination. Friedrich ran. He wasn't proud of it then, and the shame would follow him for the rest of his life. But in that moment, survival overrode everything. He turned and sprinted down the communication trench, hearing the boom, boom, boom of the shotguns behind him, hearing the screams of men being cut down, hearing the wet sound of buckshot hitting flesh. He ran past German soldiers trying to set up defensive positions, past officers shouting orders that no one could hear over the chaos, past wounded men crawling toward the aid stations. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out, and still he could hear those terrible shotguns behind him, getting closer, always closer. Finally, he collapsed in a reserve trench, gasping for air, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold his rifle. Around him, other survivors stumbled in, their eyes hollow with shock. No one spoke. What was there to say? They'd been trained to fight rifle fire, machine guns, artillery, gas, flamethrowers. But this was something new, something that turned the close-quarters brutality of trench warfare into a one-sided massacre.
An officer appeared, a young lieutenant Friedrich didn't recognize, trying to organize a counterattack. But when he asked for volunteers, nobody moved. They'd all seen what those shotguns could do. They'd all heard the stories that were now terribly, horribly confirmed. The Americans had brought hell to the trenches, and the Winchester Model 1912 was the demon carrying it. As the chaotic morning turned into afternoon, Friedrich found himself in a casualty clearing station behind the lines, not because he was wounded, but because he'd been swept up in the flood of men retreating from the front. The station was overwhelmed, doctors and medics moving between rows of groaning wounded, the air thick with the smell of blood and disinfectant and gangrene. He sat on an ammunition crate, still holding his rifle, still trying to process what he'd witnessed. His hands had finally stopped shaking, but his mind kept replaying those moments in the trench. The impossible speed of fire, the devastating effect of each shot, the way men he'd known for years had been torn apart in seconds. An older Hauptmann, a captain, was moving through the station, talking to survivors, gathering information for an after-action report. When he reached Friedrich, he sat down heavily on a nearby crate and pulled out a notebook. "Name and unit," he said wearily. Friedrich answered mechanically, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "And what did you see?" the Hauptmann asked. Where to begin? How to describe what he'd witnessed? Friedrich took a deep breath and started talking. He described the attack, the Americans breaking through, the weapon they carried. As he spoke, he watched the Hauptmann's expression change from professional interest to concern to something approaching horror. "This shotgun," the Hauptmann said when Friedrich finished. "You're certain it fired multiple times without reloading?" Friedrich said, 6 shots, maybe more, so fast I couldn't count. And then the soldier just kept pumping it. Each pump was another shot. No pause, no reloading, just continuous fire. The Hauptmann wrote rapidly, his pencil scratching across the paper. Others have reported the same thing. The Americans call it a trench gun. Winchester Model 1912, we think. It's a pump-action shotgun modified for military use.
A shotgun? Friedrich couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. But shotguns are for hunting birds, for sport. This was a weapon designed specifically for trench warfare, the Hauptmann finished, and apparently it's devastatingly effective. He explained what intelligence officers had been able to piece together. The Winchester Model 1912 was a civilian sporting shotgun that the Americans had adapted for military use. They'd added a bayonet lug, a perforated steel heat shield over the barrel, and sling swivels. But the real innovation wasn't in the modifications, it was in how they were using it. The shotgun fired 12-gauge shells loaded with 00 buckshot, 9 lead pellets, each roughly the diameter of a 9mm pistol bullet. At close range, those 9 pellets created a spread pattern that made aiming almost unnecessary. Point the gun in the general direction of the enemy, pull the trigger, and everything in a cone in front of you died. But even more devastating was the slam fire capability. The Model 1912 had a design quirk. If you held the trigger down and worked the pump action, the gun would fire automatically with each pump stroke. What should have been a slow, deliberate hunting weapon became a rapid-fire death machine that could empty its 6-shot magazine in under 2 seconds. In the confines of a trench, the Hauptmann said quietly, where combat happens at ranges of 5 to 10 meters, where there's no room to maneuver, where a rifle with a long barrel is almost a liability, this weapon is perfect. The Americans train special troops, trench cleaners they call them, to use these shotguns in close-quarters combat, and from what we're seeing, they're terrifyingly effective. Friedrich thought about Otto, about the way one shot had erased him from existence, about Hans, barely 18, thrown backward like he weighed nothing, about Sergeant Richter, who'd served in the army for 12 years and survived dozens of battles, only to be overwhelmed by a weapon he'd never imagined possible. "What can we do against them?" he asked. The Hauptmann was quiet for a long moment, staring at his notes. Finally, he looked up, and Friedrich saw something in his eyes he'd never seen in a German officer before: defeat. "I don't know," he admitted. "In open combat, at range, our rifles are superior. Our machine guns can hold them off. But in the trenches, when they get close enough to use those shotguns," he shook his head. "We're filing protests with the High Command. We're arguing that shotguns are inhumane weapons that violate the laws of war. We're demanding the Americans stop using them." "Will they?"
The Hauptmann gave a bitter laugh. "We used poison gas at Ypres. We pioneered the flamethrower. We introduced unrestricted submarine warfare. And now we're complaining about shotguns? The Americans will laugh at our protests, and they'd be right to do so." He stood up, closing his notebook. "Get some rest, Corporal Weber. They'll be sending you back to the front tomorrow." As the Hauptmann walked away, Friedrich sat in the gathering dusk, surrounded by wounded men and the smell of death, and realized something fundamental had changed. For years, the trenches had been a stalemate where both sides possessed roughly equal firepower. But the Americans had found an asymmetric advantage, a weapon that turned the close-quarters nightmare of trench combat into a one-sided slaughter. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. Germany was exhausted, starving, running out of men and material. But now, in these final weeks, the Americans were demonstrating that they didn't just have superior numbers. They had superior innovation, superior adaptation, superior willingness to do whatever it took to win. That night, as Friedrich tried to sleep on the cold ground, he heard distant gunfire from the front lines, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw that American soldier rounding the corner, saw the wicked profile of the Winchester Model 1912, heard the boom, boom, boom that had ended so many lives in seconds. Tomorrow he would go back. Tomorrow he knew he might not be lucky enough to run. The Winchester had come to the Western Front, and nothing would ever be the same.
October 9th, 1918. Dawn broke cold and merciless over the Argonne. Friedrich Weber stood in the assembly trench with what remained of his company, 37 men out of the 90 who'd held the line 2 days ago. Their faces told the story better than any casualty report. Hollow eyes, trembling hands, the look of men who'd seen something that violated the fundamental rules of warfare. The new commanding officer, Oberleutnant Ernst Zimmermann, was a transferred staff officer who'd spent most of the war behind a desk in Cologne. He wore a fresh uniform that seemed to mock the mud-caked survivors around him, and his voice carried the brittle confidence of someone who'd never heard a Winchester slam fire through a trench. "Gentlemen," Zimmermann announced, checking his pocket watch as if punctuality mattered in hell. Intelligence reports the Americans are consolidating their gains. We're to mount a counterattack at 0600 hours to reclaim the forward positions. Fix bayonets and prepare to advance." Nobody moved. The silence stretched so long that Zimmerman's confident expression began to crack. "Did you not hear the order?" he demanded. A voice spoke from the back. Corporal Ernst Becker, a machinist from Stuttgart, who'd been at the front since 1915. "We heard it, Herr Oberleutnant. We're wondering if you've heard about what's waiting for us up there." Zimmerman's face reddened. "I'm aware of the American shotguns. They're a propaganda tool, nothing more. Close-quarters weapons with limited range and slow rates of fire. Our rifles and discipline will carry the day."
Friedrich watched several men exchange glances. Limited range? Slow rate of fire? This officer had no idea what he was sending them into. "Permission to speak, sir," Friedrich heard himself say. Zimmerman nodded curtly. "The Winchester isn't like anything in our training manuals. In a trench, at 5 meters, one shot can kill multiple men, and they can fire 6 rounds in under 2 seconds. I've seen it. We all have." Friedrich gestured to the survivors around him. "A bayonet charge against men with those weapons is suicide." For a moment, Zimmerman seemed uncertain. Then, his training reasserted itself. The rigid Prussian military doctrine that had served Germany well for decades, but was rapidly becoming obsolete in this new, terrible war. "We don't question orders, Corporal. We execute them. Now form up." They formed up because soldiers always did, even when they knew the orders were death sentences. Friedrich found himself in the second wave, 20 meters behind the first line of attackers. He checked his rifle one more time, made sure his bayonet was properly seated, and tried not to think about Otto's chest exploding or Hans being thrown backward like a puppet with cut strings. The whistle blew. Men climbed the trench ladders and advanced into no man's land, moving through the pre-dawn gloom toward the positions they'd abandoned the day before. Artillery support was minimal. Germany's shells were running low, rationed for more critical sectors. The Americans, by contrast, had ammunition to burn. Their guns opened up almost immediately, but the barrage was light, almost perfunctory. They didn't need artillery to stop this attack. They had something better. Friedrich's group reached a shell crater and dropped in, using it for cover. Through the smoke and darkness, he could see the captured German trenches ahead, now flying American flags. No movement visible, no sound except the distant rumble of guns and the ragged breathing of terrified men. Then the first wave reached the trench line. The sound began immediately, that terrible boom, 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 boom that Friedrich's nightmares were made of. Muzzle flashes lit up the trench like camera flashes, each one marking another volley of buckshot tearing through German flesh. Men fell in clusters, not the individual deaths of rifle fire, but wholesale slaughter. The survivors tried to retreat, stumbling over their own dead, and the shotguns followed them, that relentless pump-action rhythm never stopping. "Second wave! Advance!" Zimmerman screamed from somewhere behind them. Friedrich looked at the men around him in the crater. None of them moved. They'd just watched 30 men die in under a minute. Advancing wasn't courage, it was assisted suicide. "Advance, damn you!" Zimmerman appeared at the crater's edge, pistol drawn. "That's an order!" Corporal Becker stood slowly, rifle in hand. For a moment, Friedrich thought he might shoot the Oberleutnant. Instead, Becker simply said, "Then you go first, sir. Show us how it's done." Zimmerman's face went white. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The sound of the Winchesters continued from the trench ahead. Boom, 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 punctuated by screams. Finally, without another word, Zimmerman turned and scrambled back toward the rear. They never saw him again. Becker took command by default. "Right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to wait here until it's light enough to see properly. Then we're going to retreat in good order back to our lines.
Anyone have a problem with that? Nobody did. They sat in that crater while the sun rose, listening to the occasional burst of shotgun fire as the Americans finished off the wounded from the first wave. When they finally moved, it was backward, using every scrap of cover, expecting bullets in their backs at any moment. But the Americans let them go. Perhaps they understood that breaking men's will was more valuable than killing them. Or perhaps they were saving their ammunition for the next attack. Back in the German reserve trenches, Friedrich found himself part of a strange gathering. Word had spread about the Winchester, and soldiers were desperately trying to understand the weapon that was terrorizing the front lines. An impromptu meeting formed in a large dugout. 50 or 60 men crowded into a space meant for 20, talking over each other, sharing stories, trying to make sense of the impossible. An older Feldwebel, sergeant named Gustav Brandt, stood on an ammunition crate, calling for quiet. Brandt had been a gunsmith in civilian life, and men deferred to his expertise. "All right, listen," Brandt said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I've been collecting information from survivors across the sector. Let me tell you what we're dealing with." He pulled out a crude sketch he'd drawn based on survivor descriptions. The Americans call it the Winchester Model 1912 trench gun. It's based on a civilian sporting shotgun, pump action, meaning you manually work a slide to chamber each round. Standard capacity is 6 rounds in the tube magazine.
"But they fire faster than that," someone called out. "I counted 8 shots without reloading." Brandt nodded. The Americans modified some of them to hold 8 rounds, but that's not what makes them deadly. It's this feature called slam fire. The gun's trigger mechanism has a design quirk. If you hold the trigger down and pump the action, the gun fires automatically with each pump stroke. The Americans discovered this and turned it into a combat technique. He demonstrated with his hands, mimicking the rapid pumping motion. An experienced operator can empty the magazine in under 2 seconds. At close range, with buckshot spreading out in a cone pattern, you don't even need to aim carefully. Just point in the general direction and pull the trigger. "What's buckshot?" a young private asked. "Hunting ammunition," Brandt explained. Each shell contains 9 lead pellets, roughly 9 millimeters in diameter. When fired, they spread out in a pattern. At 5 to 10 meters, typical trench fighting distance, that pattern might be half a meter wide. Everything in that cone gets hit by multiple pellets simultaneously. The dugout went quiet as men processed this information. Friedrich thought about Otto again, about that single shot that had done such terrible damage. 9 projectiles hitting at once. It made a horrific kind of sense. "There has to be a weakness," Becker said. "Every weapon has limitations." Brandt nodded slowly. "There are weaknesses. The shotgun is devastating at close range, but essentially useless beyond 50 meters. The spread pattern becomes too wide, the pellets lose energy. Out in the open, our rifles are superior. The problem is, we're not fighting in the open, we're fighting in trenches." "What about armor?" someone suggested. "Body armor might stop buckshot." "Might," Brandt agreed, "but we don't have body armor, and even if we did, buckshot at close range has tremendous energy. You might survive, but you'd have broken ribs at minimum, and the Americans would just aim for your head." "Gas?" another voice suggested. "Force them out of the trenches?" "They have gas masks same as us. And using gas in the confined spaces where these shotguns excel, we'd be gassing ourselves as much as them." The suggestions kept coming, each one shot down by practical reality. Longer bayonets to keep the Americans at a distance, but bayonets were useless when 6 buckshot rounds turned you into meat before you could close in. Grenades? But the Americans threw grenades too, and better ones. Flamethrowers. Rare, unreliable, and the Americans had Winchesters specifically for dealing with flamethrower operators. "But they fire faster than that," someone called out. "I counted 8 shots without reloading." Brandt nodded. The Americans modified some of them to hold 8 rounds, but that's not what makes them deadly. It's this feature called slam fire. The gun's trigger mechanism has a design quirk. If you hold the trigger down and pump the action, the gun fires automatically with each pump stroke. The Americans discovered this and turned it into a combat technique. He demonstrated with his hands, mimicking the rapid pumping motion. An experienced operator can empty the magazine in under 2 seconds.
At close range, with buckshot spreading out in a cone pattern, you don't even need to aim carefully. Just point in the general direction and pull the trigger. "What's buckshot?" a young private asked. "Hunting ammunition," Brandt explained. "Each shell contains 9 lead pellets, roughly 9 millimeters in diameter. When fired, they spread out in a pattern. At 5 to 10 meters, typical trench fighting distance, that pattern might be half a meter wide. Everything in that cone gets hit by multiple pellets simultaneously." The dugout went quiet as men processed this information. Friedrich thought about Otto again, about that single shot that had done such terrible damage. 9 projectiles hitting at once. It made a horrific kind of sense. "There has to be a weakness," Becker said. "Every weapon has limitations." Brandt nodded slowly. "There are weaknesses. The shotgun is devastating at close range, but essentially useless beyond 50 meters. The spread pattern becomes too wide, the pellets lose energy. Out in the open, our rifles are superior. The problem is, we're not fighting in the open, we're fighting in trenches." "What about armor?" someone suggested. "Body armor might stop buckshot." "Might," Brandt agreed, "but we don't have body armor, and even if we did, buckshot at close range has tremendous energy. You might survive, but you'd have broken ribs at minimum, and the Americans would just aim for your head." "Gas?" another voice suggested. "Force them out of the trenches?" "They have gas masks same as us, and using gas in the confined spaces where these shotguns excel, we'd be gassing ourselves as much as them." The suggestions kept coming, each one shot down by practical reality. Longer bayonets to keep the Americans at a distance, but bayonets were useless when 6 buckshot rounds turned you into meat before you could close in. Grenades? But the Americans threw grenades too, and better ones. Flamethrowers, rare, unreliable, and the Americans had Winchesters specifically for dealing with flamethrower operators.
"So what do we do?" Friedrich asked. "Just die when they attack?" Brandt was quiet for a long moment. "We adapt or we die. Those are the only choices." He outlined what tactical information they'd gathered. The Americans used their trench guns in specialized teams, 2 shooters with Winchesters, backed by regular riflemen, supported by grenade throwers. The Winchester operators went in first, clearing the immediate trench, while the riflemen covered longer approaches. It was a refined system, brutally effective. "The only way to counter them is to deny them the close-quarters environment where they excel," Brandt said. "We need to reorganize our defensive positions, create firing lanes where we can engage them at range, use grenades aggressively to keep them back, fall back in good order rather than fight to the death in positions they've already penetrated." "High Command will never approve," someone said. "That's practically admitting defeat." "High Command isn't here. They're not the ones facing these weapons. We either adapt on our own or we die following outdated doctrines." That night, the men in Friedrich's sector began making unauthorized modifications to their defensive positions. They widened certain fire bays to allow for quick retreat. They stockpiled grenades at strategic points. They created secondary defensive lines 50 meters back, where rifles would have the advantage. They did it quietly, without orders, because orders from distant headquarters were written by men who'd never heard a Winchester slam fire. But even as they worked, Friedrich knew it was too little, too late. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. The Americans were fresh, well-supplied, and equipped with weapons like the Winchester that gave them devastating advantages in the close-quarters fighting that dominated the Western Front. Germany was exhausted, starving, running out of everything except determination, and even that was failing. October 27, 1918. 15 days before the armistice, though nobody knew it yet. Friedrich's sector had been relatively quiet for 2 weeks, just occasional patrol actions and artillery exchanges. But intelligence reported the Americans were preparing another major push. This time, Friedrich's unit was ready. They'd transformed their defensive position based on Brandt's suggestions. The forward trench was lightly held, just enough men to provide warning and delay. The main defensive line was 30 meters back,
positioned on higher ground with clear fields of fire. Between the two positions, they'd created a killing zone laced with barbed wire and pre-registered mortar points. The theory was sound. Let the Americans take the forward trench with their shotguns, then hit them from prepared positions at ranges where rifles dominated. Avoid the close-quarters fight where the Winchester reigned supreme.
The attack came at dawn, heralded by the now familiar American artillery pattern. Friedrich was in the main defensive position, manning a firing port with a clear view of the forward trench. His hands were steady this time. Fear had been replaced by something colder, more professional. He'd seen the worst the Winchester could do. Now he was going to see if German tactical adaptation could counter it. The American preliminary bombardment was brief but intense. Then came the infantry, moving fast, using the tested tactics that had worked so well before. They hit the forward trench with explosive violence, grenades, rifle fire, and the terrible sound of Winchesters clearing the positions. But this time, instead of German soldiers fighting to the death in the confined spaces where shotguns excelled, they found the trench lightly held. The defenders fired a few shots and retreated according to plan, falling back through prepared routes to the main line. Friedrich watched through his firing port as American soldiers poured into the captured forward trench, consolidating their position. They were clustering together, packed into the confined space, exactly as planned. He could see the Winchester operators clearly, two of them, confident, weapons held ready, looking for targets. "Range is 60 meters, Brandt's voice called out. "Fire on my command. 3, 2, 1, fire." 40 rifles opened up simultaneously. At 60 meters, with clear lines of sight and prepared firing positions, German marksmanship training paid off. Americans fell, some cleanly, others wounded, all surprised by the volume of fire coming from positions they hadn't expected. The Winchester operators tried to return fire, but at this range, their shotguns were useless. The buckshot pattern was too wide, the pellets lacking energy. They were armed with the most devastating close-quarters weapon of the war, and it couldn't reach their attackers. Friedrich worked his bolts smoothly, acquiring targets, firing, moving to the next. This was the kind of combat German soldiers had trained for, disciplined rifle fire from prepared positions. For the first time since encountering the Winchester, he felt like he was fighting on equal terms. The Americans adapted quickly, pulling back from the exposed forward trench, using smoke grenades to cover their withdrawal. They'd achieved their objective, penetrating the German line, but at heavy cost and without the easy victory they'd expected. As the smoke cleared, Friedrich could see bodies in the forward trench, both German and American. The Winchesters lay among them, their distinctive profiles now motionless. Deadly weapons rendered useless by simple tactical adjustment. Brandt appeared beside Friedrich, looking through the firing port at the scene below. "We stopped them," he said quietly. "Cost us 8 men in the forward position, but we stopped them."
"Will it work again?" Friedrich asked. Brandt shook his head. "Once, maybe twice. Then they'll adapt their tactics, bring up more artillery, flank us, or simply bypass this position. But for today, we proved the Winchester isn't invincible. Every weapon has its limitations. Every advantage can be countered." That afternoon, something unprecedented happened. An American officer approached under a white flag, accompanied by a stretcher-bearer team. Brandt went out to meet them, while Friedrich and others covered the exchange from the trench. The American officer was a captain, young, but carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd seen heavy combat. Through a translator, he requested permission to retrieve his wounded from the forward trench. In exchange, he offered medical supplies, morphine, bandages, disinfectant, items that were desperately scarce in the German lines. Brandt agreed. For 2 hours, an informal truce held, while both sides recovered their casualties.
Friedrich watched as American stretcher-bearers moved through the forward trench, handling German wounded with the same care as their own. One of them, a medic with a Red Cross armband, even treated a German soldier's leg wound before carrying him back to the German lines. During the exchange, Friedrich found himself face to face with one of the Winchester operators, a sergeant from Tennessee who'd survived the assault with only a minor shoulder wound. The man was sitting on a sandbag, his trench gun lying across his knees, waiting for the medics. They stared at each other for a long moment. Enemy soldiers, separated by 3 meters of neutral ground and an ocean of shared experience. Finally, the American spoke in broken German. "You fight good today. Smart. Not like before." Friedrich nodded slowly. "Your weapon, it's effective." The American looked down at the Winchester, running his hand along the pump action. "It's hell in a box," he said quietly. "Nobody should have to fight with these. Nobody should have to face them." He looked up at Friedrich. "This war is ending soon. Maybe next time we meet, we don't have to shoot at each other." Friedrich watched him walk away, limping slightly, the distinctive profile of the Winchester Model 1912 silhouetted against the gray sky. The weapon that had terrorized him, that had killed his friends, that had changed the nature of trench warfare forever. It was just a tool, carried by a soldier who was just as tired of war as Friedrich was. The final 2 weeks of October 1918 passed in a strange twilight. Everyone knew the war was ending. Rumors of armistice negotiations filtered down from high command, and even the fighting took on a different character. Attacks became less frequent, more cautious. Nobody wanted to be the last man to die in a war that was already lost. Friedrich's unit rotated out of the front lines on November 3rd. As they marched back through devastated French countryside toward the rear areas, he thought about everything he'd witnessed. The shock of first encountering the Winchester, the terror of seeing its effects, the slow process of adaptation and counter-tactics, the gradual realization that even the most devastating weapon could be understood, countered, survived. On November 11th at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. Friedrich was in a rest camp near Metz when the news arrived. Men stood in the streets, not celebrating, not quite mourning, just absorbing the fact that after 4 years, 51 months, 1,500 days, the killing had stopped. That evening, he wrote a letter home, not to Heidelberg, which he learned had been occupied, but to his sister in Munich, who'd somehow survived the food shortages and Spanish flu. In it, he tried to explain what he'd experienced, what he'd learned. "We thought we understood modern warfare," he wrote. "We thought our training, our discipline, our superior tactics would carry us through. But the Americans showed us something different. They didn't fight by our rules. They adapted civilian tools for military purposes. They found asymmetric advantages and exploited them ruthlessly. The Winchester shotgun, a hunting weapon for God's sake, became one of the most feared weapons on the Western Front simply because they recognized its potential in an environment where traditional military thinking said it had no place." That's the real lesson of the Winchester. Not that shotguns are deadly, we knew that from hunting, but that military innovation comes from questioning assumptions, from asking, "What if?" instead of, "That's not how it's done." The Americans won because they were willing to think differently about old problems. We lost because we clung to doctrines written for a different kind of war. He never mailed the letter. It seemed too critical, too dangerous in the uncertain political climate of a defeated Germany. But he kept it, along with his other war souvenirs: a spent shell casing from a Winchester round, a small piece of the perforated heat shield that had broken off a trench gun,
his service documents.
He eventually found work as a clerk in a government office, a humble position for a man with his education, but jobs were scarce and competition fierce. At night, he attended veteran gatherings where former soldiers tried to process what they'd experienced. Everyone had stories about new weapons that had changed warfare: tanks, aircraft, gas, flamethrowers. But when Friedrich spoke about the Winchester, men who'd fought on other sectors listened with peculiar intensity. "We heard rumors," one veteran said. "We thought they were exaggerated, propaganda to excuse our defeats." "They weren't exaggerated," Friedrich replied. "If anything, the reality was worse than the rumors." The Americans had found a weapon perfectly suited to trench warfare, and they trained men to use it with devastating effectiveness. The Winchester Model 1912 service in World War I became a footnote in most histories, overshadowed by more dramatic weapons. But among those who'd faced it, the memory never faded. Friedrich met other survivors over the years, men from different sectors, different units, all sharing the same haunted look when someone mentioned the American shotgun. In the 1920s, military theorists began seriously studying what had worked and what had failed in the Great War. Friedrich was occasionally consulted as part of these studies, his experiences recorded in official reports. He explained how the Winchester's effectiveness came not from revolutionary technology, but from recognizing that trench warfare created unique tactical requirements that traditional military weapons didn't address. "The shotgun wasn't designed for military use," he told one interviewer. "That's what made it so effective. It was designed for hunting, for hitting fast-moving targets at close range in confined spaces." The trenches were confined spaces. The combat was at close range. The Americans simply recognized that a hunting weapon was perfect for this specific environment. The interviewer, a young lieutenant who'd been too young to fight in the war, asked the obvious question: "Why didn't Germany develop similar weapons?" Friedrich thought for a long moment before answering. "Because we were fighting the war we'd prepared for, not the war we were actually in. We had excellent rifles, superb artillery, well-trained soldiers, but we were so committed to our existing doctrines that we couldn't see alternative approaches. The Americans came fresh to industrial warfare, without our preconceptions, and they were willing to try anything that might work." The controversy over the Winchester Model 1912 didn't end with the armistice. The German government formally protested its use, arguing that shotguns violated international laws of warfare because they caused unnecessary suffering. The protest was detailed, legalistic, and ultimately ignored. The American response was blunt. Germany had introduced poison gas, flamethrowers, and unrestricted submarine warfare. Complaints about shotguns seemed hypocritical at best. The protest was quietly dropped. But the Winchester had proven a point that would echo through the 20th century. In warfare, effectiveness matters more than tradition. The weapon itself was relatively crude, a modified sporting shotgun with a bayonet lug and heat shield. But in the right tactical situation, wielded by trained operators, it was devastating. After the war, military forces worldwide studied the Winchester's use. Some adopted similar weapons for specific roles: boarding parties, security forces, close-quarters specialists. Others dismissed it as situational, effective only in the unique conditions of trench warfare. But everyone acknowledged that the Americans had identified an asymmetric advantage and exploited it ruthlessly. Friedrich followed these discussions with interest. In his later writings, he argued that the Winchester represented a fundamental shift in military thinking. Previous generations fought with weapons designed specifically for war, but modern industrial society produces countless tools that can be adapted for combat. The side that recognizes these opportunities first gains significant advantages. The Winchester wasn't a military weapon that happened to work well in trenches.
It was a civilian tool that proved superior to military weapons in a specific tactical environment. That distinction matters. He lived to see the Second World War, where his predictions about adapted civilian tools proved eerily accurate. Submachine guns based on simplified industrial manufacturing, Molotov cocktails turning bottles into anti-tank weapons, radar adapted from commercial radio technology. Each innovation followed the pattern the Winchester had established. Take what exists, adapt it for new purposes, deploy it faster than enemies can counter. Friedrich Weber died in 1956, age 62, from complications of old war wounds. His funeral was small. A handful of fellow veterans, his sister's family, a few former students. The obituary in the Heidelberg newspaper mentioned his service in the Great War, but provided no details. Among his personal effects was a small wooden box containing his war memorabilia, the spent Winchester shell casing, the piece of heat shield, his service documents, and a photograph taken during the informal truce on October 27, 1918, Friedrich and the Tennessee sergeant standing awkwardly together while medics worked in the background, enemies caught in a moment of mutual respect.
On the back of the photograph, in Friedrich's careful handwriting, was a note. The weapon changed warfare. The men using it were just soldiers like us, doing what they were ordered to do. Remember the lesson. Forget the hatred. In the end, the Winchester Model 1912 served as more than just a weapon. It became a case study in military innovation, tactical adaptation, and the psychological impact of asymmetric warfare. Modern military historians point to it as an early example of disruptive technology, not because it was technologically advanced, but because it disrupted established tactical doctrines. The Germans weren't wrong to fear it. In the confined, brutal environment of trench warfare, the Winchester gave American forces a significant advantage in close-quarters combat. Casualty studies from late 1918 show that German losses in trench assaults where Winchesters were employed were significantly higher than in assaults using only rifles and machine guns. But the real impact was psychological. The sound of slam fire, that rapid boom, 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 that could empty a magazine in under 2 seconds, created terror disproportionate to the weapon's actual casualties. German soldiers who faced it reported a sense of helplessness, of being overwhelmed by firepower they couldn't counter. That psychological impact affected morale, combat effectiveness, and willingness to defend positions aggressively. Friedrich Weber understood this intuitively. In his writings, he emphasized that the Winchester's greatest weapon wasn't the buckshot, it was the fear. When soldiers believe they face an unstoppable weapon, they've already lost the most important battle, the battle in their own minds. The Americans understood this. Every time a Winchester fired, even if it missed, it reinforced the mythology of the weapon's invincibility. Breaking that mythology required not just tactical adaptation, but psychological resilience. The Winchester Model 1912 continued serving in American military forces through World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, though never again with quite the psychological impact it achieved in the Argonne Forest. Modern combat had moved beyond trench warfare, reducing the situations where shotguns provided significant advantages, but it remained a respected weapon for specific roles: boarding parties, building clearing, close protection. Today, original Winchester Model 1912 trench guns are collector's items, valued both for their historical significance and their representation of a unique moment in military history. Museums display them with explanatory placards describing their use in World War I. Military historians cite them in studies of tactical innovation. And occasionally, very old veterans, great-grandsons of the men who fought in the Argonne, share stories passed down through generations about the American shotgun that sounded like thunder. Friedrich Weber's story is one of thousands, millions even,
of individual soldiers who experienced specific aspects of the Great War's industrial horror. But his encounter with the Winchester Model 1912 and his efforts to understand and counter it illuminates something important about warfare, innovation, and human adaptability. When faced with a weapon that seemed invincible, that violated all the rules of warfare as he understood them, Friedrich didn't give up. He observed, learned, adapted, and survived. He recognized that even the most devastating weapon had limitations, that tactical innovation could counter technological advantages, that survival required abandoning preconceptions and thinking creatively about new problems. That lesson, more than any specific detail about shotguns or trench warfare, is the enduring legacy of the Winchester's thunder in the Argonne Forest. In a war that killed millions and broke empires, small innovations like adapting a sporting shotgun for combat made significant differences. The side that adapted fastest, that questioned assumptions, that was willing to try unconventional approaches, that side won. And in the confined hell of the Western Front's trenches, where men fought and died in mud and blood and darkness, the sound of the Winchester Model 1912 slamfire became the soundtrack of adaptation, innovation, and the relentless march toward victory. The weapon itself was just metal, wood, and mechanical ingenuity. But what it represented, the willingness to question, to adapt, to find new solutions to old problems, that was the real weapon that changed the war. Friedrich Weber understood that, and in understanding it, he survived to tell the story. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.